Joined now by Matthew Dallek, a professor at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management and author of Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. Matthew, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me on.
For sure. So, this topic is endlessly fascinating to me. I love historicizing the extremism of the Republican Party. It's just really important for people to know it's not just, the appearance of orange bad man, but a continuation of a decades-long project from a lot of different groups, notably the John Birch Society. And we had Edward Miller on, I think, 2 years ago to talk about this very topic.
Okay.
But it's just I can't get enough of it. So for people,
here we are.
So yeah. Here we are, and your book is excellent, and we'll link to it in the description so people can check it out. But for people that might not know, what is the John Birch Society?
Yeah, so the John Birch Society was a group, a grassroots activist group from the 1960s. It was organized all over the country, 60 to 100,000 members, mostly white, mostly Christian, many of them upwardly mobile members. And the group, at least the headquarters, argued that there was an internal communist conspiracy, basically that there was a threat within the United States. It was the greatest threat to the country, and it was communist inspired. And so the Birchers' goal essentially was to try to root out that threat by educating the American people about the menace in their hometowns.
I want to return to the anti-communism, which is super important to understand. But when you describe them as, Christian, white, and upwardly mobile, it reminds me of the January Sixers, where there was like a small kind of bump in the news cycle where people were saying like, the January 6th rioters, they're just misled. They don't have a ton of like financial means and stuff. And people looked into some of their class background, and a lot of them are, upper middle class, small business owners, with backyard like pools and things like that in different pockets of the country. And that seems to be very similar to the people that you reference here or talk about.
Yeah. Well, I actually end the book with January 6th, essentially. And you never want to take the echoes or the parallels too far, but absolutely there are. Look, one of the things I argue is that the Birch Society helped show the far right and subsequent generations of far right activists how to forge a primarily white Christian cross-class alliance, including the super wealthy, which is how the Birchers started, a handful of extremely wealthy, mostly businessmen, a lot of upwardly mobile professionals, doctors, engineers, with some echoes of the January 6th types, ex-military, and then also some white working class folks as well later in the decade, I think, primarily.
So then to touch there on the anti-communism, how did the John Birch Society get established in the midst of the anti-communist hysteria, and how did they compare to, say, the McCarthyist, more mainstream anti-communism that we also saw was incredibly destructive?
Well, look, Joe McCarthy was actually one of the heroes to a lot of Birchers. And what's a little ironic is that the Birch Society, which was founded in 1958, was actually founded in the kind of middle of the Cold War, but not in the early 50s or late 40s, right? It was, I wouldn't say that it wasn't quite the time for a détente, but they did come after McCarthy. And the Birch founders looked at Joe McCarthy and other conservative heroes, anti-New Deal, hard-line anti-communist heroes, and they argued that they had been sidelined, right? That they had been, as Robert Welch, the founder, once wrote, he argued that Bob Taft, a senator from Ohio, who was another hero, that he may have been killed by a radium tube that had been implanted in his Senate seat and that had caused the cancer that had murdered him. So you see the not just the conspiracy theories, but you see the martyrs, and so they very much operate. And one of the key distinctions between anti-communists like John Kennedy or Dwight Eisenhower and the Birchers is that the Birchers saw the greatest threat as fellow Americans, right? It was coming from within, and basically branding a lot of Americans, including at times people like Eisenhower and media figures, communists, right? Traitors to the country, that they had betrayed the Constitution. I mean, that was why the campaign to impeach Earl Warren resonated with a subset of Americans, because, the argument was that Warren, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, had aided and abetted the communists with a variety of his decisions. And so, there was a legacy predating 1958, predating the 60s, in which they had these martyrs. They picked up on the martyrdom and they looked at the enemy within, and that distinguished them, at least in part. They also had other ideas too that I argue that distinguished them from more mainstream conservatives.
Can you expand on the going after Warren and trying to impeach the Chief Justice there? Because obviously it's a great connection to draw, where this like conservative far right movement goes makes overhauling the Supreme Court a major objective, and you can obviously see the shadows of that today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the time, now impeaching a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, impeachment doesn't sound so radical, right? We've been through impeachments, right, with presidents. But at the time, in the early 60s, the idea that you were going to impeach a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which, was constitutional, but it was still seen by most people as a radical step. It wasn't really done. And then, of all people, they're targeting Warren. And Warren was seen, first of all, former Republican governor of California, appointed by Eisenhower, and really an emblem of the establishment, and seen as the architect of a number of great liberal decisions, including most notably Brown versus Board of Education, desegregating the schools. And other decisions too, like putting a ban on prayer in public schools, or affording rights to criminal defendants. Well, to many Birchers, these decisions, Brown most notably, but others too, was a pattern of unconstitutional, pro-communist state expansion, right? Giving the federal Leviathan more and more power to trample on what they saw as individual liberties. And so the Birchers put up billboards all over the country that became actually iconic. You could see them, driving, going to upstate, wherever you were going. And they were hard to miss. And so even though a majority of the country did not want to impeach Earl Warren and thought it was sort of absurd, there was a subset who were mobilized by this idea and really passionate about it, to the point they used their own money, in some cases, to erect these billboards. So you see how a single issue sort of package in a powerful way can mobilize people, even if it doesn't succeed.
And it packages the anti-communist fears with racism and fears of change, right? Which leads to levels of conspiracy, I would imagine, that like become the hallmark of the John Birch Society and the Birchers. Is that fair?
Yeah. Well, the Birchers certainly engaged in a number of conspiracies, and one of their hallmarks, as you say, was the conspiracism. There was also a more explicit racism. Not all Birchers, I don't think, were racist, but there were a good number who were, and who were also anti-Semitic. There was an argument among Birchers. They wanted to essentially repeal the New Deal, right? They wanted to, which is part of the reason they loathed Dwight Eisenhower. They saw him as accepting the New Deal. They wanted to repeal the New Deal, and they opposed the entire post-World War II international order. One of their other slogans was "Get the U.S. out of the United Nations." And one of their insights, I think, was that they were able, by branding all of these issues as communist, as pro-communist, they were able to define the enemy as they saw it, with a real epithet, but apply it to many different areas of American life, including also, I should mention, what we know today as these hardline culture wars, sort of banning books, putting pro-Americanist literature in schools and libraries. So they were early adopters, and again, by saying they're all communist dominated, they're all un-American. They were able to mobilize a good number of people in support of all these causes.
Can you talk about the anti-democracy element there, of how Birchers, we can also make a connection. Like, it's this imposition of fundamentalist Christianity and a democracy. They might call it a democracy, but isn't really that, right? Or it's about rights for certain people to impose on others.
So another slogan they had was, we're a republic, not a democracy. Let's keep it that way. So they were very explicit that they didn't want democracy. Robert Welch, I believe, one of the founder of the movement, he said that democracy was tyranny of the mob. So what did they mean? Well, it meant different things to different people. For some, I think it did mean imposing a kind of Christian moral order, as they defined it, on the rest of the country. To others, it meant that majority rule trampled, again, as they saw it, on the rights of states and individuals to live their lives free of federal harassment and interference. And so democracy, they argued, essentially was contrary to the Constitution, contrary to the things that made America great, and that therefore it had to be opposed. So they were anti-majoritarian, and very explicitly so. And they made no kind of bones about it. Although I would say one big difference between then and now is that you didn't see the kind of election denialism among the Birchers back then as we see today, for I think various reasons. But that's one distinction. But yeah, they didn't like democracy.
It's a distinction, but it's also, you can describe it as an evolution, right? Where it fits into the current context, but it's kind of a very similar framework.
Yeah. Yes. And if you're going to argue, as some Birchers did, that Dwight Eisenhower was an agent of the communist conspiracy, or that Chief Justice Earl Warren was pro-communist, or many other, pretty moderate liberals and conservatives even were communists, well, you're really saying that, they're not legitimate, right? That they're foreign agents or foreign directed agents. That's also, by the way, what they did with the civil rights movement. They called it communist dominated, right? That it wasn't an organic struggle to promote African-American aspirations, social justice, and civil rights. It was actually Kremlin directed. And so there is a way in which they delegitimized a lot of democratically elected individuals and figures, or appointed individuals and figures, and also grassroots democratic movements for racial equality.
The notion of political actors being puppets of foreign forces is also something I'd love to explore, because you touch on the anti-Semitism of it. We hear about globalists all the time on this program. We know what that means. It means the Jews, or, very well, or wealthy Jews, the Jews. I don't even need to parse it. Yeah. So, I mean, how much of that too can you trace back to a lot of these conspiracies?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I argue is that the conspiracy theories of the Birchers, they do act as a kind of permission slip for a lot of racists and anti-Semites in particular, in part because, a lot of, as one Anti-Defamation League operative said after Kennedy was killed, that a lot of conspiracy theorists are going to blame the communists for Kennedy's death, and then they're going to add the usual Jewish fillip to the conspiracy. and I think it's an insight that applies to a lot of these conspiracy theories, right? that something is wrong, either inside or outside the country. There is a cabal of these elites. They're unseen in a way, or their wealth is unseen, and they are manipulating, kind of traditional American ideas, values, and people. And so, what you have, what I try to document in the book, and I wasn't going into the research knowing what I would find, but what I do try to document, and clearly not every member of the Birch Society was anti-Semitic, but there were a lot of them. And the Birchers at times try to police their ranks of anti-Semites, but there were so many of them, it was very hard for them to do. And I think as the 60s wore on, they attracted more and more anti-Semites to the ranks, became even more radical. And just a last quick point, I think in terms of today, I do see MAGA and Trump in some ways descending and becoming more radical themselves, because the conspiracy theories almost set people, if a conspiracy theory helps to define a movement, it helps set people on I think a more radical path. And the Birchers kind of follow that trajectory to some extent.
And you mentioned Trump there, but now I'm just curious, as these Bircher chapters get set up throughout the country, and perhaps their kind of way of thinking becomes a little bit more widespread, like as we move into the 60s and beyond, what candidates in the modern Republican Party or from that period on do you see as most aligned with birtherism? Trump maybe not included because you just used that example.
Yeah. You mean post-60s?
Yes.
Yeah, post-60s. Well, I do go through in the last third of the book, sort of bringing us from the 1970s to the present. I think there are a number of figures, many of whom run for president. People like John Schmitz and Tom Anderson. Schmitz was actually a member of Congress. They ran for president. They're both Birchers and ran for president on a third-party American party ticket in 1972. Pat Buchanan in the 1990s is a popular analogy, but I think, and actually, interestingly, not only did Buchanan pick up on some of the ideas, some of the isolationism of the Birch Society, I think some of the anti-Semitism and concerns about sovereignty, but actually in 2000, this is little remembered, but he picked a vice presidential nominee or candidate who was actually in 2000 a national spokeswoman for the Birch Society at the time, because it still existed then and still does today. So his running mate was a card-carrying Bircher, and people like Ron Paul. Ron Paul is, I think, an important figure. He actually, often talks about his great friendship with Larry McDonald, who was a leader of the Birch Society in the late 70s, in the 70s and early 80s. But also how, the Birch Society really are constitutionalists, according to Paul. And so, and some of the conspiracy theories, concerns about sovereignty, isolationism or anti-interventionism, the idea of shrinking the federal government, down to this pre-New Deal era. Those ideas, I think Paul, I don't know if he appropriates directly, but he certainly, gets some ideological inspiration from the Birchers. Those are a few, but there are many, there are others too, including Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann and others.
Lastly, another thing that really strikes me is the way that these chapters were set up and activated these groups on a local level. That's something I think we're seeing now with school boards, where if you can activate them at your John Birch Society chapter, they're going to be voting in every election, and they're going to be super involved. Like, that is key to understanding the modern Republican Party too.
Yeah. And one of the things I argue is that 60 to 100,000 incredibly passionate and well-funded people devoted to a cause can have a greater impact than maybe millions of voters who just turn out at election time, because they can protest, they can picket, they can push issues onto the agenda, they can take over a PTA or a school board, or maybe create a controversy about what books are on the shelf library. There's a kind of superpower almost that they wield. And they do it, as you point out, really at the local level, in this case, chapters, And it is, I think, similar to the outsized impact that we're seeing from, say, groups like Moms for Liberty, right? Who are today, who, a handful of individuals can set in motion a process where a book gets taken off, let's say, a school library, and then it gets vetted and reviewed, and maybe it gets put back on or not. So that dynamic, I think, it shows the power of grassroots local activism, and how it's important also to have counteracting forces, both grassroots and institutional, that are, in a way, defending democracy and pluralism and other values that, to a lot of Americans, the United States stands for.
Well, everyone should check out this book, learn more about the John Birch Society. It's very helpful to being a good opponent of the Republican Party and MAGA and Trumpism and all that today. Matthew Dallek, author of Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. We'll put a link to the book in the description wherever you're listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much, Matthew.
Emma, thank you for having me on. It was great.
For sure. Yes, it was. I agree.